We'll ask what Italians make of their national car makers' loss of independence and assess the challenges facing vehicle manufacturers everywhere. Also this half hour, why more people can't get a good night's sleep these days and what to do about it, and the rise of home fitness businesses at the time of year when many people usually join a gym.
Suddenly the world of at-home fitness exploded. There was the Joe Wicks phenomenon, which kind of introduced people to YouTube stars and the workouts that they provide on there for free. And then I think that led into finding different apps.
We'd love to hear your views on the stories we're covering on the programme today. As always, you can tweet to me. I'm at RobYoungUK. The word Stellantis sounds like a distant planet, or perhaps a new science fiction TV series. Stellantis is, however, the rather curious name of the world's fourth biggest car maker, a new entity formed with some of the most venerable brands in the world of automobiles. In the past few hours, shareholders in Fiat Chrysler, which also owns Jeep and Maserati, and PSA, which owns Peugeot, Citroën and Opel, have given their approval to this mega merger. The new company brings together companies from Italy, France and the United States. Fiat's proud car-making history dates back more than a century, so why did the firm agree to be subsumed into a bigger group? Eric Silvers is a reporter for the Wall Street Journal in Milan in Italy.
This is a company that was founded in 1899, so obviously has a very long history. But it's not just the longevity, it's really been, the history of Fiat has been intertwined with the history of Italy pretty much since the beginning. It was the company that really introduced the mass market car to Italy, to much fanfare and so on. And then during the Second World War, the factories were commissioned to make armaments for the fascist army, so there was polemics there. Then in the aftermath of the war, there was Gianni Agnelli, who is probably the family figure that's most well known both in Italy and outside of Italy, sort of became a national figure, both as a playboy and his yachts off the French Riviera, but also because that was the time when Fiat really exploded, really became a powerhouse, not just in Italy, but in Europe. It was, for a while, it was the largest car maker in Europe, and it was and still is the largest non-government employer in Italy. So it really, when it was time to hire, or was time to close a factory or try to reduce a factory. It really became national issues. And for a while, the national issues were also European issues just because it was such a big company.
And here we have this hugely important company from Italy merging with a French company, an arch rival for many, many years. How do Italians view this?
It's a mixed bag because on the one hand, I think there's a realization among a lot of people. I'm not sure it's filtered down perhaps to all the people who work in the factories, but I think there is a general understanding that Fiat it was having difficulty competing internationally for various reasons. So it's been 2009 that Italy began joining forces with Chrysler, and since about 2014 that it's been known as Fiat Chrysler. But it's been, some time that the Italian brands have been struggling. Fiat, Maserati. Maserati has a lot of cachet value for the brand name, but it's really been struggling for years. Fiat's been losing market share. It's on the low end of the market in the car industry is really, really tough place to be because the margins are razor thin. So the company, the combined company, Fiat Chrysler, has been held up for the last maybe 5 or 6 years really by the American business. It's hard to not realize that just because the numbers are so clear. So I think even people who don't follow the business pages, they realize that Fiat is not what it once was. So on the one hand, I think there's the realization that this could be a new start for the company. It makes sense to be bigger for various reasons. But at the same time, there's a lot of angst here because, and not just among the workers, among politicians and more generally, because it's hard to imagine how you combine two huge companies and you don't find a way to reduce the staff.
Eric Silvers there in Milan. The deal between Fiat Chrysler and Peugeot brings together the 8th and 10th biggest car makers to form the 4th biggest, with combined sales of about 8 million vehicles a year. So the new company is huge, bigger than America's Ford and General Motors. The rationale for the merger and the challenges that Stellantis is likely to face tell us the story of the global car industry today. Stuart Masson is the editor of The Car Expert, so we should know what he's talking about.
There's a couple of paths they could choose. They could take quite a regional approach, which is what Vauxhall and Opel have done here in Europe, where Vauxhall and Opel have basically been the same company for decades, but the cars here in the UK are sold as Vauxhalls. In the rest of Europe, they're sold as Opels. So they could take that sort of approach. The other approach is that they could say we don't need 14 car brands and we'll start culling it down to a more realistic number so we have less competition amongst ourselves. We have at the moment Peugeot, Citroën, Vauxhall, Opel and Fiat all competing in a very similar space. So it may be that they decide they don't actually need all of those brands.
Whether there are fewer brands or not, do you think the new group will be looking at closing factories, laying off some workers?
PSA, certainly before the merger, said that they had no intention of closing factories. I think you can probably take that with all the same grain of salt you'd take any political promise in an election year. I think there will inevitably be factory closures. One of the key motivators for these sorts of mergers is to reduce costs, to streamline production, to stop having a number of different car platforms, so you try and base as many cars on the same architecture underneath, and that inevitably means you can produce the same number of cars in fewer factories. So I think that's inevitable. It's going to happen.
There's been a big change in the way that many people travel because of the pandemic. Do you think that makes car makers' life just much more difficult? And I just wonder whether a bigger company is necessarily better if perhaps being more nimble is potentially an advantage.
The industry is undergoing enormous change, and that predated the pandemic. We're seeing an enormous shift from internal combustion engines, petrol and diesel, towards electric vehicles, predominantly battery-based. That's been happening at the same time the pandemic's going on. The pandemic is certainly changing how people view their transportation needs. Do I need as many cars? What sort of cars do we need in our household? How that's all going to play out in the longer term, I think remains unseen. In the short term, we're seeing people putting off purchases. That will start to come back, but the types of cars they're going to buy are going to be very different. And there's a debate as to whether or not one mega company can cope with enough change around the world, or whether small and nimble companies will be able to gain market share in the way that someone like Tesla has done in America.
Well, you mentioned Tesla, and I suppose that is another motivating factor for this merger and others like it, because you've got Fiat and Peugeot, previously rivals, one Italian, one French, and they are coming together because the future of cars is not in petrol or diesel powered engines, it is in electric engines, and I suppose the big rivals are not other European car makers anymore, it is Silicon Valley.
It is to a degree. There is certainly a new player, but the big European rivals, and the biggest of all is Volkswagen Group, are still very much going to be strong rivals. These companies, the new Stellantis, Volkswagen Group, companies like Toyota, are investing billions and billions of pounds, euros, dollars, whichever currency you like, into electrified cars, electric motors, plug-in hybrids, hydrogen fuel cell cars. Companies like Tesla certainly have got a good head start, and they made some good inroads, while the greater car industry, like an oil tanker, was taking a long time to turn around. But that is very much underway, and you're going to see big companies like Volkswagen, Stellantis, Toyota, that do have a lot of resources, are going to be throwing all of them at electrified cars, and they may well simply outspend smaller companies who can't keep up.
Stuart Masson. Well, we can now talk to Rachel Winter, Associate Investment Director at Killick & Co. Hi, Rachel.
Hello.
What's happened to the share price of car companies today?
They're both up about 2.5% at the moment, so the market has reacted positively to the news of the merger, but it has been on the cards for a long time now, so it's really not a big surprise. But nevertheless, the market is happy about the prospect of some future cost cutting. At the moment, car companies need to be investing huge amounts of money into new electric technologies, and by merging, these two companies are making sure that they won't have to duplicate that investment and that they can share that cost in future.
OK, let's have a look at some of the other stories around today. Coronavirus restrictions are to tighten in the UK. Scotland is to go back into a lockdown at midnight. The UK Prime Minister will set out measures for England later, just as the second vaccine has started to be administered. What do investors make of the UK's rising infection numbers and the action being taken to tackle it?
There is some concern about it. So if we look at the stocks in companies that are really focused on the UK economy, such as UK banks, for example, Lloyds or NatWest, and also UK house builders, those are companies on the UK Stock Exchange that are really heavily exposed to the UK economy. And those types of stocks are quite heavily down today. So that does show you that investors are a little bit concerned about this new wave of the coronavirus.
OK, now it's the first business day since the UK fully left the European Union's structures at the end of December. How's it gone so far?
No major disasters as yet, so I think the news is quite positive. I think investors remain quite relieved that a deal was struck at the last moment, and the pound remains at a relatively high level compared to where it has been. And so at the moment, you get $1.36 to the pound, which is much more than you would have got about a year ago.
And the US company MGM Resorts is trying to buy the British company Entain, which owns a large bookmakers Ladbrokes. Is this all about the liberalisation of sports betting in America?
Absolutely. So online gambling in the US has not been allowed previously. Those restrictions are starting to be relaxed, and we're now starting to see a lot of US casinos trying to buy European online operators because they've got that technology there already. So I think this is something that we will start to see a lot more of.
OK, thank you, Rachel. Rachel Winter there from Killick & Co. It's often said the key to a good day's work is a good night's sleep. But lockdowns, worries over health and anxiety about jobs have led to restless nights for many. So what, if anything, can we do to nod off? Elizabeth Hodson has been finding out in this extended report.
Dream, 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 dream.
For many of us, the upheavals of 2020 have played havoc with our work and home lives, and unsurprisingly, there's also been an impact on our sleep. Gracie Tyrrell, who co-owns the Squirrel Sisters snack food business, is just one of the countless people who've been struggling to adapt.
I've worked from home for about 3 years now, but since COVID, since lockdown, my sleep pattern has changed dramatically. I feel absolutely exhausted when I wake up as if I haven't slept, and my dreams have become a lot more vivid and unusual. I believe the reason for this is because it's really hard to distinguish when the working day starts and when it ends.
Dr. Kat Lederley is a chronobiologist who runs Somnia, a company which aims to help people get a good night's sleep. She says that working from home and the lack of boundary between work and leisure environments can play havoc with our circadian rhythms.
Our body clock is a little bit sort of in maybe limbo state, sort of not knowing, is it daytime now or is it nighttime now? And that can have a negative impact on our sleep. Everything in the body runs on a 24-hour rhythm, and the body clock sets the beat. It's also that we spend much more time sitting down, so there is less activity. Regular exercise is sort of not happening anymore, or not as it used to. But also the rhythm of eating might have changed, and all of that has an impact on our clock and eventually on our sleep. You could almost say that work life is really seeping into home life.
So how can we get our body clocks to reset?
What people can do is to re-establish a rhythm that's much more in line with their own biological rhythm set by their body clock. The biggest thing for me actually is to create a really strong pattern of light and dark, meaning spending time outdoors, preferably in the early morning, but certainly in the daytime. And even on an overcast day, it's still so much brighter outdoors than it is inside your house. So if you can, in the morning, go for a walk. And you could, at the same time, use this as a sort of fake commute, right? And sort of on your return back into your house or your flat, that's when work then starts.
We're living in times of worry, with many of us anxious about our jobs. So there might be a temptation to work longer hours just to prove we're being productive. But is this a good strategy?
No, I don't think that's a clever idea at all.
Professor Dan Hammermesh is a specialist in labour economics at Columbia University.
First of all, the employer, in most cases, isn't looking at your hours. He's looking or she's looking at what you do.
So do you think that the way that people look at the link between sleep and productivity and economic activity will change post-2020? Is there anything that people like yourself who look at these links can learn from what's happened this year?
That's a very interesting question. I mean, let's assume that the big change is going to be that people who are white-collar workers, a lot of them will no longer be commuting every single day. in that sense, I think they will look at it differently, and by having more time at home, maybe revise their views of the sleep productivity link. In other words, be a little bit more sensible about balancing sleep and work. So I think that's actually a rather productive change if that happens. And I think it will happen for some people, not all, obviously.
Is there anything that employers can do to incentivize their workers to be more productive?
I think the best way for an employer to do that is to not pester people who just happen to be online and at their computer all the time. This is very hard to do because I want to show, as you said, the employer that I'm willing to work hard. But employers ought to realize they don't need that. They can get the productivity out of workers without making them constantly at their beck and call. And making them at their beck and call, employers need to realize will lead workers to sleep a less than optimal or a more than optimal amount.
But it's not just getting enough sleep that's the problem. It's also what happens when we're asleep. Along with countless other people, Viva Andrada O'Flynn has experienced extremely vivid dreams during the pandemic.
I've been having strange, vivid dreams lately. I haven't been out of the house much because I've been self-isolating. My dreams are about going to crowded places like markets, malls, and grocery stores, being aware of COVID, wishing that I stayed home instead because there are so many people bumping into me in the dream.
Dr. Deirdre Barrett from Harvard University is the author of Pandemic Dreams. So far, during the pandemic, she and her team have analysed around 10,000 dreams, and she says that gender and work has a bearing on their content.
Several things were elevated for women beyond what were elevated for both genders. Both genders, fear was up, illness was up, death references were up. But for women, anger and sadness were also way up. Not only are they doing most of the homeschooling, but they're doing most of the home health care of sick relatives.
Did you find that people had more ultra vivid dreams if they were working from home, for example?
There was a stage where I had lots that were about the lockdown, and some of them mirrored working from home, but many other people had been furloughed or lost their jobs at those times, so there were some reactions to that. But the most striking thing was there was a big difference for people who were sheltering at home alone. They would have these scenarios of exaggerated loneliness and isolation, dreams about being thrown into prison. I had more than one where people had been put in solitary confinement. And then very opposite that, people who were sheltering with their family, often a more extended family than they usually lived with, or people with a lot of roommates. They were dreaming these exaggerated scenarios of crowding or lack of privacy.
But not all of these ultra-vivid dreams have had negative connotations.
All through the pandemic, there have been a few positive, hopeful dreams. People dream that they cure themselves of the disease, or they invent a cure for it that cures all of mankind, or somebody else comes up with a cure. Or there are other positive dreams that are just kind of foreseeing some utopian future when the pandemic is over, and it's changed us psychologically, and we're wiser because of it.
Concerns over sleep have already created a multi-billion-dollar industry for sleep aids, but do any of them work? Earlier this year, before the pandemic struck the UK, Stuart McGurk, associate editor of the British edition of GQ magazine, tried a whole range of sleep aids for an article he wrote.
The thing in the piece that really freaked me out the most was called a sleep robot, which was essentially a sort of robotic kidney bean which mimicked breathing. So it's like you're holding a small breathing creature, and the idea is that your breathing will align and therefore you'll calm and you'll go to sleep. I mostly just had dreams of it kind of killing me in the night, so it had the opposite of its intended purpose. Generally, the things that were very low-tech I found quite work, like a whole sector of the sleep business of weighted blankets. They come from mothers of autistic children who found it hard to get to sleep. They found that by the blankets being heavier, that their children would sleep easier. And so they started sewing pennies into blankets, and then business people realised that actually for anxious millennials particularly, but also for everyone, these kind of heavier blankets that almost like pin you to your bed. I did find there was something comforting about the fact I could move less. Things like that, which is literally just a very heavy blanket, kind of worked pretty well.
But if a weighted blanket doesn't work for you, you might want to try one of these methods, starting with a suggestion from Kim Stockdale, who runs Aspire Beauty in Yorkshire in the north of England.
I can usually sleep standing up, but 2020, it's caused a lot of worry for us in the beauty industry, and I started to wake a few times a night. I now light a candle, have a snuggle with my puppy, and pop on an eye mask before I fall asleep, and this has been my saviour.
My name is Asha Aditwim, and I am a spiritual and faith mentor. I will do my gratitude, where I'll say 3 things that I'm grateful for that day: meditation and prayer with a Bible verse. And I'll also light some candles and just really take the time to just be still and look at the moon, do some moon gazing, and just really appreciate that time that I'm having to wind down before then gently falling asleep.
And if those don't work, you might take some comfort from Dr. Kat Lederley, who we heard from earlier.
Poor sleep, in response to stress is absolutely normal. And if we can embrace it as that, then that can release actually a lot of stress.
That report from Elizabeth Hodson with a bit of musical help from the Everly Brothers. In January, gyms usually have a rush of people desperate to join and work off their Christmas excesses. For a lot of people, this year will be very different, as gyms are closed in many countries. But the past year has seen an explosion in the number of people offering home workout plans, often on social media.
Breathing through modification. Thank you, Reese. Nice high marches. Now you notice, again, high knees are called high knees because the knees are driven nice and high. Right up to that.
That's a high-intensity cardio bodyweight workout from personal trainer or PT Lita Lewis, as watched by 27 million people on YouTube. I feel exhausted just listening to it. But the numbers of people watching videos like that and those from Joe Wicks shows just how seriously people have been taking their home workouts during the lockdown. It even spurred new fitness apps and subscription services too. Jessica Salter is a lifestyle journalist who writes for the Telegraph newspaper and Vogue magazine. She's been telling me about the craze for home fitness.
Obviously, when we entered the first lockdown in March last year, gyms closed and we were just gearing up for the summer events that people had planned, and we suddenly had a lot more time on our hands. And suddenly the world of at-home fitness exploded. There was the Joe Wicks phenomenon, which kind of introduced people to YouTube stars and the workouts that they provide on there for free. And then I think that led into finding different apps like Fit, the UK London startup, which you can subscribe to, and you've got a whole range of fitness and workouts to try on there. And suddenly people realised that they actually didn't need the gym anymore. They could do it all at home.
Well, this is traditionally the time of year when people decide they have overindulged at Christmas and they need to join a gym and try and lose a bit of weight and get fit again. What do you think people will be doing right now if they can't join a gym?
Already, at the tail end of last year, outdoor workouts were already ramping up, and apps like Strava, which are communities of cyclists and runners, were recording record numbers of people getting out and doing their own thing outside. So I think people starting in January this year will already have a bit of a head start because they will have already continued their fitness perhaps later than they would have last year. And there was a lack of Christmas parties and perhaps a lack of going out in the same kind of way. So maybe we indulged a little bit less and we're starting from a better place this year.
What can you do at home? Are there limitations on the kinds of exercises or fitness regimes that you can actually do in your own living room?
Yes, there are. I mean, you can't do serious weightlifting. That's unless you've got a home gym stacked with big weights. And in fact, last summer, even kettlebells, the little weights that perhaps go up to sort of 14 kg, they completely sold out, and GQ called it a national shortage. So there's a limit there. And there is a bit of a limit on the amount that you can do with your PT over Zoom, because they're not in the room with you and they can't see exactly what you're doing. I think it's not as good as in the gym or in person, but if it means that more people are getting fitter, then perhaps that is a good thing overall.
It may not be as good, but it must be cheaper, because an awful lot of the the stuff that is on social media is totally free to consume.
Yeah, absolutely. And I slightly worry for some of the startup fitness guys because they're giving away a lot of content for free, and this is their business after all. And I've noticed that lots of people are now sort of saying, could you pay what you can, and putting up a PayPal link. So there's that side of it. But it is cheaper in some instances, but then the sky's the limit. You know, Peloton bikes have had a huge increase in sales, and their bikes are not cheap. The initial outlay is nearly $2,000, and then there's a monthly subscription as well. So I think you can spend what you like, really.
It's interesting that a whole range of new businesses have sprung up to meet this demand of people who want to try to get fit during lockdown. But what happens once the vaccines have been rolled out pretty widely and perhaps people are allowed to go to gyms again? Will we just return to doing what we did before?
There's possibly a lot of gyms that will close. It's a long time that they will be without members. I'm not sure that I would go back to the gym in the same way. I do like seeing people in person, and I like having my regular co-workout people that we see in the changing rooms, but there's no need to perhaps go 3 times a week. Maybe you just go once a week. So that's going to have an impact.
Lifestyle journalist Jessica Salter. Well, that's about it for this World Business Report. Remember, our 2 daily podcasts are always available from the BBC website and wherever you usually get your downloads. That's also the place to listen to recent episodes, including our review of the biggest stories of 2020. My thanks to today's producers, Claire Williamson and Philip Hampshire, and the studio manager, Jeremy Morgan. From them and me, bye-bye.
You're listening to the BBC World Service, and here's what's happening in the studio this week.
Wallace and Gromit are one of Britain's best-loved comedy duos. Traditionally modelled from plasticine clay, hear what happens as the team at Aardman Animations put the finishing touches on their first app, The Big Fix-Up, where fans can step inside the world of Wallace and Gromit as never before.
In the studio, Tuesday at 13:30 and 23:30 GMT. And at bbcworldservice.com, Heart and Soul.
I'm Justin Webb. I'll be talking to 2 of the United Kingdom's leading religious figures about grief and about recovery. We talk about grief and loss with those who've been through great personal tragedy and who can talk about how we might all get through times like these.
This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
Hello, well.
The first country in the world to use the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine to inoculate people against coronavirus. More than 500,000 doses are available to vaccination centres as the UK is facing a surge in infections. More from Jim Reid.
At 7:30 a.m, Brian Pinker, an 82-year-old dialysis patient, became the first person in the world to receive this vaccine outside clinical trials. He thanked the medical staff and said he can now look forward to celebrating his 48th wedding anniversary later this year. It's hoped the Oxford vaccine will play a key role in bringing the outbreak under control, partly because it's easier to store than other jabs.
France is starting to vaccinate healthcare workers over 50 amid anger at the slow progress of its vaccination campaign. President Macron is reportedly furious, criticizing the pace in one newspaper as like a family stroll. So far, the strategy has focused on administering vaccines in care homes, which face logistical problems in storing the Pfizer jab and time-consuming processes of consent. The European Medicines Agency is meeting to decide whether to approve a second vaccine produced by Moderna for use in the EU. Shareholders in the French carmaker PSA Group have approved a $60 billion merger with the Italian-American manufacturer Fiat Chrysler. If FCA investors also back the deal, it'll create the world's fourth largest automotive company. More now from Theo Leggett.
The new car giant will be known as Stellantis, a name which the architects of the deal say is derived from the Latin verb stello, meaning to cover with stars. But the rationale for the merger is rather more down to earth. The auto industry is going through a technological revolution. Electric or hydrogen power is set to take over from petrol and diesel within the next 2 decades. Cars themselves are likely to become increasingly connected and autonomous. The merger should allow the two companies to pool expertise and resources and save costs.
World news from the BBC. Millions of children have returned to school in Kenya 10 months after classes were shut due to the coronavirus pandemic. They have to wear masks and have their temperatures taken before entering schools, where some classes are being held in open air under trees. Kenya's National Union of Teachers says safety measures are inadequate and some schools lack running water for hand washing. In Ghana, President Nana Akufo-Addo announced schools would reopen on the 15th of January. The government says it'll provide the necessary protective equipment, including face masks. Iran has resumed 20% uranium enrichment at its underground Fordow nuclear facility in its latest breach of the 2015 nuclear deal. The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said the move was aimed at developing nuclear weapons and that Israel would never allow Iran to build them. The EU has also expressed its concern. Peter Stano is a Commission spokesperson.
If this announcement is going to be implemented, the announcement by the Iranian authorities, it would constitute a considerable departure from Iran's nuclear commitments under the JCPOA with serious nuclear non-proliferation implications.
The head of the global nuclear watchdog, the IAEA, is due to make a statement later today. Since 2019, Iran has broken several conditions of the nuclear deal. A court in Pakistan has declared virginity tests to be illegal and against the constitution. The Lahore High Court said the tests had no forensic value in cases of sexual violence and offended the dignity of female victims. The judge directed the Pakistani government to take steps to ensure that they are not carried out anymore. Rights activists have long demanded an end to virginity tests as part of the medical evaluation of women victims, saying they had no scientific basis. BBC World News.
Hello, welcome to OS on the BBC. Chloe Tilley with you today. Now, here on the programme each weekday, we bring you breaking stories, conversations on the trending issues, and answer your questions about COVID-19 with the help of one of our experts. In around 10 minutes' time, Dr. Eleanor Murray from the Boston University School of Public Health is going to be here with us to talk about, amongst other things, the first rollout of the new Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine here in the UK. If you've got a question for Dr. Murray, you can get in touch now via WhatsApp. It's country code 4477 30 75 19 25, and we'll try and get as many answers as we can to your questions in around 10 minutes or so. But let's begin by speaking about this. A court in London has ruled that the WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange cannot be extradited to the United States. The 49-year-old is wanted over the publication of thousands of classified documents in 2010 and 2011, which the US government claims broke the law and endangered lives. Well, let's bring in the BBC's Helena Wilkinson, who's been following this story. Now, Helena, people listening around the world may well recognise the name of Julian Assange, but not fully remember the background to this. So remind us who he is and exactly what he's accused of doing.
Yes, so Julian Assange, he's 49 years old. He's an Australian national. You touched on what his work was. He set up in 2006, so a long time ago, he set up a website called WikiLeaks. That website published confidential documents and images, and it was back in April of 2010 when Julian Assange really hit the headlines around the world, and that's because the website WikiLeaks, it released footage which apparently showed US soldiers shooting dead 18 civilians from a helicopter in Iraq. So he has gained a huge amount of support around the world, and we saw that outside the Old Bailey today when we had that hearing handed down by the judge. His supporters would say that he is a campaigner for the truth, that he exposes governments. However, to his critics, and there are many of those too, they would say that he seeks publicity. And also on those charges that you mentioned, the US prosecutors, he is wanted on various charges which the American lawyers during his extradition hearing said that put lives in danger, and he's accused of putting a massive sensitive information into the public domain.
So why did this court in London rule that he can't be extradited to the United States?
So the judge heard both from defence barristers representing Julian Assange and also prosecutors for the Americans. Now, it's important to point out that there was a hearing that took up a lot of last year in London. The first extradition hearing had to be stopped because of the coronavirus pandemic. It then resumed at the Central Criminal Court, also known as the Old Bailey, in London last year, and arguments were heard in court. So it wasn't a trial, but what the district judge had to decide was, based on the evidence she heard, whether Julian Assange should be extradited to America to face trial there on those charges. And today, earlier on, she blocked that extradition request. Now, when she went through why and her decision making, she essentially said that the US prosecutors had met the test for Julian Assange to be extradited. And a reminder of what the US prosecutors were saying, they had said that he was guilty, they say, of releasing the classified documents, and that, they say, put lives in danger. Well, his defence barrister said if he was to be extradited to America, he wouldn't face a fair trial, and the charges that were being brought against Mr. Assange were politically motivated. Well, the judge dismissed most of Julian Assange's defence arguments that were heard in court. However, she went on to touch on his mental health issues, and that was something that was argued in court, that Julian Assange had significant mental health issues. And she said, the district judge said, that he could not be extradited on those grounds. She said that there would be a risk of suicide if he was extradited to the United States. And it was for that reason that she decided that extradition would be oppressive by reason of mental harm. And that's the reason why she discharged it. And to his supporters outside, they were celebrating when they heard this news, the ruling that he would not be extradited.
So what happens now? I mean, Julian Assange is actually in prison in the UK, isn't he, anyway? So explain a little bit about that, and then obviously what we're expecting from the US.
Yes, so Julian Assange has been at a high security prison called Belmarsh Prison in the UK. He's been held there for over a year now, and there have been various complaints made through his defence lawyers about the conditions that he's been held in there. What will happen next is that on Wednesday, his lawyers will argue at a magistrate's court in London that he should be bailed. Now, what's going to happen is, we know US prosecutors are going to appeal against this decision that's been handed down by the district judge. They have 14 days in which they can lodge their grounds for appeal to the High Court in London. But in the meantime, Julian Assange will want to try and apply for bail. Now, that will be heard on Wednesday in front of the same district judge at a magistrate's court. We understand that prosecutors for the United States will try and oppose that bail application. That is listed for 10 o'clock UK time on Wednesday, and we expect that to last for about an hour. So it's difficult to say at this stage, if he is successful, whether Julian Assange will at that point walk out of the Magistrates' Court, which will be, of course, a big moment, or whether he will be then taken back to Belmarsh, process, that kind of thing can take a number of hours. So on Wednesday, he will find out if he will be released on bail. But US prosecutors, as we know, are planning to appeal against this decision by the district judge, which was handed down today. So we could see many, many more months of legal proceedings in this case, which has been going on for over a decade.
That's the BBC's Helena Wilkinson, bring us right up to date on that story surrounding Julian Assange. Now, we're going to be talking lots about coronavirus vaccines on this edition. And let's bring you a story now about a campaign to encourage vaccinations in Poland, which seems to have backfired. There's anger that a hospital in Warsaw invited leading actors and a former Prime Minister to have their jabs and therefore effectively jump the queue. Let's speak now to our Warsaw correspondent, Adam Easton, who filed on this story earlier on. And we asked him to come on live and give us some more details. So, Adam, this was an idea to what? Get more people to want a vaccination?
That's right. That's what the hospital is saying, at least. There's been one or two opinion polls which have suggested that an overwhelming majority of Polish people are worried about the potential side effects of the vaccine. So this hospital said it had an additional 450 doses of the vaccine, most of which it decided to administer to its own workers and family members of those staff. But it also wanted to raise awareness of the vaccine and have these very well-known people take this vaccine to promote the campaign. At the moment, Poland, like other countries in the European Union, it's been vaccinating since the 27th of December. And at the moment, it's only healthcare workers who are getting the vaccine. Now, there's some confusion here about what the government's saying, on one hand, there may be scope to have people outside of that group being vaccinated. And at the same time, it said that this hospital, this is the Medical University Hospital of Warsaw, was not within its rights to actually invite these celebrities to have this vaccine. And in fact, we only learned of this when these celebrities started going on to social media and posting, oh, I've had the vaccine, one of them being Krystyna Rianda, perhaps one of the most well-known Polish actors. She appeared in many of Andrzej Wajda's films. And the response to that post that she put on Facebook was overwhelmingly negative. I mean, if you look at it now on Facebook, the first response you see coming up is from a lady called Monika Skjosz. And I'll translate what she says briefly. She says, I'm a doctor. I examine a lot of people daily and not by phone, she writes. And I can't wait to get vaccinated. And you already have? What did you have to do to get it? And so, that's a flavour of sort of the anger that this queue jumping, which it's been seen as, has provoked amongst many people here in Poland. It's seen as, the elite, again, is getting, has more privileges than ordinary people. That's what was reflected in many of the posts as well. And in fact, some of the actors have said, I thought I was taking part in this really clever campaign, and it's turned into a nightmare.
Well, I wanted to ask you that, if there had been any reaction from them, if they were actually regretting doing this, because presumably they went into it in good faith.
Well, that's right. And certainly Miss Yanda's daughter, she's a 45-year-old actor as well. She's called Maria Severin, and she posted a video online expressing her regret and saying that now she regrets her decision to also go in and have the vaccine. She says she went in with her father, who's 74-year-old, to have this vaccination. And a doctor basically said, we've got a spare vaccine now. If you want it, you can have it. And she took it, she said. And she says she now regrets that. On the other hand, the former Prime Minister, Leszek Miller, who was a left-wing Prime Minister in the early 2000s, says, no, this is nonsense. This is... These are vaccines that were available and they would have gone to waste had they not been used by New Year. And he's a senior citizen now. He's an MEP in Poland, but he says that completely defends his decision to take the vaccine and raise awareness of the campaign.
Thank you, Adam. That's our Warsaw correspondent, Adam Easton. This is OS on the BBC with me, Chloe Tilley. Let's take a look at some of the other coronavirus headlines that you may have missed today. A hospital in the US state of California is battling a coronavirus outbreak that's believed to stem in part from an inflatable Christmas tree costume. According to local news stations, the costume worn on Christmas Day by a member of staff was powered by a fan that may have spread droplets around the emergency room. And more than half of the people in France don't want the COVID-19 vaccination. That's according to a new poll. It comes as the government faces criticism that inoculations there are going far too slowly. Meanwhile, in China, thousands of people have been lining up in the capital Beijing to get vaccinated ahead of next month's Chinese New Year celebrations. Inoculations have been stepped up since Thursday, when the country first gave official approval for a domestically developed drug. Now, it's that time of day that we bring in our coronavirus expert for this edition, and today it's Dr. Eleanor Murray. She is Assistant Professor of Epidemiology at Boston University School of Public Health. Dr. Murray, great to have you back with us.
Great to be here. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year, absolutely. Now, we've got to obviously talk about vaccines, so much focus on vaccines, and real excitement that the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine now is starting to be rolled out. The first person to have their dose here in the UK, an 82-year-old dialysis patient in Oxford, very apt this morning. There's lots of enthusiasm behind this vaccine. Goodness me, we need lots of hope right now, don't we? How much hope can this give us, and over how much period of time?
Yeah, so I think that this is great news to have this vaccine being rolled out and given to people. We have, really ideally the goal is to vaccinate the majority of people on the planet. So the more vaccines that we have at our disposal for that, the better that is. In terms of, the individual people who are getting the vaccines, they should expect to see that protection start kicking in about a week or 2 weeks after getting the vaccine. Most of the vaccines have a second dose that they'll need to get at some point as well to just kind of boost that response. But so for the people who are getting the vaccine, the next couple of weeks, they'll start to see a benefit from that. For everyone else, ideally the goal is enough people get vaccinated that we start to see the cases come down. But that's going to be probably months away, sort of realistically. We could, in theory, vaccinate a bit quicker than that, but there are a lot of hurdles. Having people to do the vaccinations, getting the vaccines out to the different vaccination sites. So, I think the goal is to vaccinate those people who are most at risk of poor outcomes first, and hope to at least bring down the hospitalization and death rates, if not the cases yet.
One of the big questions, of course, when we first knew about the first vaccine being developed, and it gave so much hope to everybody, but one of the questions was, it stops you getting ill, but do we know yet whether it stops that person infecting somebody else if they have it?
Yeah, so this is something that wasn't a primary part of the goal of the vaccine trials, to figure out if it stops people from being able to transmit the vaccine, the virus. what we know from other vaccines is that it's a pretty good chance that it at least reduces the transmission risk. And so hopefully that will be something that we'll see, but we're still kind of investigating that. We're still collecting data on how much it might reduce transmission. So at the moment, really the focus is on those people who are going to be most at risk of needing to be hospitalized or of dying, to keep them as safe as possible. And for everyone else, just to try keep wearing masks and keep reducing transmission in the other ways that we've been doing.
We also need to talk as well about the vaccines in India, and there's a huge conversation there. Formally, 2 have been approved. One is that Oxford AstraZeneca jab that we were just talking about there. Another one is made by an Indian firm, Bharat Biotech. And some opposition politicians, some doctors are really quite unhappy about this. They feel it has been rushed through because it hasn't gone through those phase 3 clinical trials. You can understand the desperation of governments to roll out a vaccine, but clearly people need to know that this domestically made Indian vaccine is safe. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so I think it's really important to have those phase 3 trials because, as you say, people need to know that the vaccine is safe. We need that evidence. People need to understand that the science isn't getting rushed, even if, the timeline has been quick for these vaccines. Another thing that's really important is that, if this vaccine turns out to not work as well once it gets rolled out, or turns out to have some side effects that they didn't see in their smaller earlier studies, that could undermine trust in all the coronavirus vaccines. It could undermine trust in other vaccines like the polio vaccine or the measles vaccine. And so that's a really big concern among a lot of scientists, that pushing out coronavirus vaccines without doing phase 3 trials could lead to undermining trust in all vaccines and increase in all different kinds of vaccine preventable diseases.
Let's have a listen to this. We've been putting out on our WhatsApp phone for people in India to contact us with their views on the vaccine. And this is one message that we've received.
Hi, I am Shweta Mishra from India. I think we are in extreme times, facing extreme pressures to do something positive to fight this COVID-19. The Covaxin is coming as a beacon of hope. I think we should be willing to take the risk, and we should be willing to get away with phase 3 trials or peer-reviewed. It has not been published in peer-reviewed journals, and just for that reason we should wait and let people not get vaccinated and let people die. We should certainly go ahead with the vaccination program of Covaxin. I am totally with it.
Just to be clear, we are just talking about this vaccine in India. We're not talking about any other vaccines. They've all been, that have been approved. They have gone through those trials. But this Indian firm, Bharat Biotech, hasn't gone through the phase 3 clinical trial. What is that phase 3 trial doing? Is that just checking how efficient it is?
So the phase 3 trial is both checking how efficient it is and also checking for side effects. So the earlier phase 1 and phase 2 trials just see, does the vaccine produce any kind of immune system response, and are there any major side effects that would be immediately a problem for this vaccine that we would have to stop and consider something else. Phase 3 trials are those big ones that enroll, tens of thousands of people, maybe hundreds of thousands of people even. And really that allows them to see things that happen, 1 in 1,000 times or 1 in 10,000 times, those rarer side effects that could still be problematic, and also allows us to actually know how well the vaccine works. So we've seen, with the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine, that the vaccine is 95% effective at preventing severe coronavirus disease. And we've seen with the Oxford AstraZeneca slightly lower, but still really great effectiveness. And those are things that we learn from the phase 3 trials. So when Shweta is saying, this vaccine, we should be giving it to people because it works, that's actually the big question. Without those phase 3 trials, we actually don't know, does it work? How well does it work? We also don't know, how safe is it? Are there any side effects that we need to be concerned about? Could it be giving people dangerous side effects. And that's why the phase 3 trials are important.
And it is worth saying that the Drugs Controller General of India has said both manufacturers have submitted data showing their vaccines are safe to use. So it's important that we say that. Now let's spend a couple of minutes now before the news talking about schools, because lots of schools that have been closed for many months are starting to reopen. Kenyan students returning for the first time since March, Pakistan and Ghana announcing that their schools are going to reopen later this month after long shutdowns. Lots of talk about how much schools contribute to the spread of coronavirus. What is the current evidence?
Yeah, so I think the important thing to remember about schools is they have large groups of people in indoor settings for prolonged periods of time. And so that is the type of setting where we know transmission can happen. We also know there are ways to make schools safer. So, for example, everyone should be wearing masks, people should be spaced out. Students should be sort of cohorted, so in a room with a specific class the whole day rather than moving around with multiple students. And then also keeping windows and doors open so that there's air circulation, or even better, having really good air filtration systems. But in countries where it is a little bit warmer and hopefully not too hot, if students can be outside and doing school outside, that makes it a lot safer as well. So there's a lot of tricky trade-offs between transmission and ensuring kids get a good education and get the resources they need to, continue through the pandemic successfully. And so thinking about how to make those classrooms safer is really the key right now.
The challenge is, I've got an 11-year-old. She can wear a mask to school. She can wear a mask all day. It's fine. How do you get a 4-year-old to wear a mask and understand social distancing? That's the challenge, isn't it?
Yeah, that's the real challenge. And I think, early on in the pandemic, a lot of people were hopeful, well, maybe these kids are just not really transmitting because they didn't seem to be getting sick. But what we have seen, throughout the fall is that, yes, kids of all ages can get sick. Kids of all ages can transmit infection. And so really we need to make sure, if those kids can't wear a mask, then the adults around them need to be wearing masks. We need to keep those class sizes small. We need to keep the areas well ventilated to keep the risk of infection down.
Thank you ever so much, as ever, for coming on and answering our questions. Dr. Eleanor Murray there, Assistant Professor of Epidemiology at Boston University School of Public Health. And don't forget, here on OS, every day we have an expert on coronavirus here to answer your questions. You can send them in now. It's country code 447730 75 19 25. That's the WhatsApp number. You can send them in now, and we'll try and get as many answers for you as we can over the coming days and weeks. You're listening to OS on the BBC World Service.
Dark days have come for us all. And when things are bleak, it's hard to stand tall.
I'm feeling so sad. I don't know what to do.
But whenever hard times come to call,
the water on my face and in my shoes helps me remember that this is real, that this is no dream.
Just know that soon brighter days will be here.
You know what? No one can tell me I'm not allowed to talk about this.
Days of hope.
Gentlemen, we have arrived in the promised land.
And days of delight.
It was just pure happiness.
And days when everything just seems right.
You have conducted probably one of the greatest interviews I've ever had.
Let a BBC World Service podcast take you somewhere else.
I feel so emotional.
Search for BBC World Service wherever you get your podcasts.
Doesn't that look beautiful, you guys?
Hello, welcome to OS on the BBC. Chloe Tilley with you. Now, for many countries across the globe, children are returning or preparing to return to school. And for some, it's after an end-of-term break. For others, it's after months at home because of the COVID-19 pandemic. We're going to hear from two parents in conversation in Kenya and Pakistan who are concerned about their children returning to the classroom, but also about the long-term impact on their mental health by staying off school.
BBC News with Neil Nunes. The US Justice Department has said it's extremely disappointed and will appeal after a court in London refused to extradite the WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange. He's wanted over the leaking of secret military and diplomatic documents, but the judge in London said there was a real risk that he would take his own life in an American prison. Britain's National Health Service has begun administering the cheap and easy-to-use Oxford AstraZeneca coronavirus vaccine. It's seen as a game-changer in the fight against the virus, and in the coming months, tens of millions of doses are expected to be injected around the world. Meanwhile, President Macron has expressed his frustration at the slow rollout of the French inoculation campaign. The health authorities in Poland have begun an investigation amid public anger that a hospital in Warsaw let some celebrities and a former prime minister jump the queue to get coronavirus vaccinations. Warsaw's Medical University Hospital invited prominent Poles to get inoculated to promote a vaccination campaign. Millions of children have returned to school in Kenya 10 months after classes were shut due to the pandemic. In Ghana, President Nana Akufo-Addo announced schools would reopen on the 15th of January. Shareholders have approved the merger of Peugeot and Fiat Chrysler to create the world's fourth biggest car maker. The new conglomerate, to be called Stellantis, will combine brands such as Jeep, Opel, Citroën, and Alfa Romeo. And South Korea has called on Iran to release an oil tanker seized by the Revolutionary Guards in the Gulf. The Foreign Ministry in Seoul asked Tehran to confirm the safety of the crew. Iran accused the ship of polluting the waterway, but its operator said there was no evidence for this. BBC News.
Hello, welcome to OS on the BBC World Service. I'm Chloe Tilley. Now, we want to keep bringing you stories of how people's lives have been affected by the coronavirus pandemic. It's, of course, the start of a new year, and it seems like the same coronavirus conversation is taking place in several countries at the moment. Should children be sent to school while the pandemic continues? Well, it's a debate that's at different stages in different places. For example, children in Kenya went back to school today after a 10-month shutdown. Hilda Masimbi is a parent in Nairobi who's happy with that decision.
As a parent, I'm pleased that the children are back in school because we were really worried about the pandemic. We really wished for our kids to be back in school, and at the moment we are very happy that our kids are back in school.
Meanwhile, the governments in Ghana and Pakistan have announced they will reopen schools later this month after lengthy closures. And here in the UK, the government is insisting that children should go back to school this term in most places, despite the current surge in cases. So what does it feel like from a parent's point of view? Well, we brought together a couple of people for whom this is a really important conversation at the moment. Mukami is a mother living in Nairobi in Kenya, and Ehsan is a father in Islamabad in Pakistan. And I asked them how it's been for them having their children out of school. First, Ehsan.
It's very difficult because, as you see, it's not a regular education online classes. And you see there is so much distortion and the focus is not there. And even the youngest kid, she is in grade 1 now. She almost, remain oblivious. I mean, she never remember what she had actually in the outset. So it's very difficult for them.
So how old is she? Sorry, just to be clear, for people who don't know what first grade is, how old is that?
She is like now 6.
Right. And you've got 3 other children, haven't you? How old are they?
The elder ones are the twins. They just clear their O levels. And the middle one, she is 14 now in grade 8.
Gosh, so it's a real spread. I want to also bring in Mukami because I know that you're listening as well. You're very much at the other end of the spectrum, aren't you? Because you've got a much younger child.
Yes. I have my child who is about 4 years and a half. So she's in baby class. In Kenya, we just take them to baby class as the introduction class for them. And so the last time I took my baby to school was in March 2020. And now the schools have been reopened after a 10-month break that was occasioned by COVID-19.
And so how disruptive has it been for you and for your daughter to be out of school that long?
For me, my daughter being out of school, I mean, this was her first year, and the first year is quite important. The foundation years are quite important for a child's growth and education. So when COVID-19 came and the government shut down schools, so this proved a very big challenge to me as a parent, because then you're not even able to understand what next for your child. I'm busy, I'm at work, so I have to leave my child with the house help who takes care of her. But the house help is not able to even take care of her in terms of her education. It's not able to, teach her basic things that they are taught in school, writing, spelling, all those. So it's been a very difficult year for me in relation to that. But also for other parents, it's been a difficult year because especially in Kenya, there have been a rise in cases of, sexual abuse, especially among young girls who are out of school. Schools somehow act as the safe haven for many of the girls, but the closure of schools due to COVID has made cases of sexual violence and abuse go up. Yeah.
So it's not just the education for some girls, it's also just personal safety, which is just utterly terrifying. Ehsan, tell me about your children. I mean, having 4 children anyway, I can imagine is quite a challenge, but have you been able to help them with their education whilst they've been out of school for 9 months?
Well, it's a very difficult ask basically because the only way to assist them, to help them is online. And we are not satisfied with the online classes here because it's not regular, first of all. And then the other way, because the kids are kids, we can't force them to, sit, they are immature.
And it's hard for parents, isn't it? And I know I was having to homeschool my children for 6 months whilst also working. And it's a real challenge, isn't it? Because you need to work, you need to bring money home so you can put food on the table, but you also want your children to have an education. And Ehsan, as you say, they don't want to learn. They don't want to be taught by mum and dad, do they? Because I was told by my daughter that I wasn't a very good teacher.
Yes, true, actually. You're 100% right because in the outset you told me that you are a mother also and your kid. So you understand the situation here. Most probably the most difficult part is for the women, the housewives. My wife is a housewife basically, and she faced a real challenge basically. Again, in Pakistan, I just want to bring this point here that I am also having an association in Pakistan, which is for the parents, we have Pakistan Private Schools Network, Parents Network. So this one is like we just are in the courts also against these schools because they are charging a very, full fee. And, we request them, the government level also, and from the media, that because you are not, opening the school on the regular basis and it's online. So you should reduce the fee to 50%. But unfortunately, we are unable to succeed in this, mission. And so they are charging as it is. And the business and economical situation is not that healthy in Pakistan either. And it's really crunch time for us, not only financially, but inside the house, like my wife, actually, all the day I'm just watching her, she's trying very hard. So everything is there, it's bad timing.
And it's interesting you say that because, Makami, I wonder, do you see, your daughter's obviously very young, but do you see the effect on her mental health of being at home and not being with her friends?
Yes, it's much an effect to my child because, one moment she's at school, she started having friends, creating friends at school, and then the next moment they're at home. So it's hard for her to understand. Another thing that my fellow parent there in Pakistan is saying is that, for example, me, I'm a working mother and I work from home. So work demands too much time from you. So the moment your daughter wants something from you, she wants attention. She's a young child. She wants attention from the mother. And then I'm like, no, please, I'm working. Just give me time. You can actually see that it's having a mental effect on her. So you as a parent, I'm left with the guilt of feeling like I'm not being there for my child as it should be.
Yes, true. You see, most probably my 2 kids, like the youngest one, she's 6. Well, she has no social setup now, no friends around, and she is like a very difficult child nowadays because she wants my attention to be there now because the mother is busy with other things. This is for them is psychologically what you call very damaging, should I say it. And not only to her, but even the elder one, she is 14, even she is now very much, missing her friends.
So if that's the case, you're both talking about obviously the downsides of the schools being closed. Does that mean that both of you, do you feel pleased that the schools are now reopening in your countries? Makami first, are you pleased?
As for me, I think as a parent, I'm a bit torn in between because I'm happy that the schools are opening and not my child has to go back to school. But at the other side, I'm worried because, first of all, the safety of the child. I know the government has said that they have put full compliance to COVID-19 protocols across the country, across all schools. But there's that fear that this is a small child. You cannot control her movements. So the moment she goes, touches something, maybe she forgets to wash her hands. The teacher doesn't see, so that means maybe she can even bring the disease back at home. So that's a challenge. But I'm impressed because when I went to take my child to school today, I went to a school, they have put quite strict guidelines in terms of how the children, for example, on social distancing. They have also emphasized on the importance for parents to ensure that their children have proper masks. And also they have said that the school is going to provide soap and water for those parents who cannot be able to buy hand sanitizers for their children. So I'm torn in between.
Makami, I'm really interested. You talked there about them having to wear masks at such a young age. Can you get a 4-year-old to wear a mask?
When I went to school to take her today, just in 10 minutes, I could see parents who already brought in their children, but within 10 minutes, the children had their masks on their necks. So like that became a big challenge for me.
What about you, Ehsan? What's the situation with mask wearing? And I guess it's easier with your older children. Your 6-year-old?
Yeah, listen, Pakistan and Kenya is like the underdeveloped countries. We people are living in a common living system, like where elders are there also. It's not only safety problem for the kids, but the 60, my grandmother, my mother or my father, they are also going to suffer if the school, they just carry the infection to home. It's more likely to give them the infection also. Now in the schools, last time why they closed everything, because at the gates they are, manifesting everything, like they are having the mask there also, the sanitizers also. But inside the school, how could you, conduct this operation? Like how could you keep the kids having a mask all the day? And there are more than 400 kids each time. So what we suggest actually to the school administration now, because our minister actually just today they give this statement that we are going to open the schools by the 15th of January. Now the problem is this: we ask them that we can compensate this, keep this school closed till March, because COVID will be in a peak time, high rise, on the rise to during these months. So if you want to open, please open after March, 1st of March, do it. And then the summer vacations, don't give the summer vacation in June, basically. And though
so that's
we are very
interesting.
much
So you're suggesting that schools should stay closed now for another 2 months, but instead of having the summer holiday break, children should continue to go to
Yes.
school through the summer to catch up.
Yes, to catch up, because the safety is the priority basically in our case, because this now the winter season is all the way, and the COVID spread more fastly, and in UK there's another new variant that spreads more quickly than the first one. So we are in a situation where we don't know what happens next actually.
And Makami, in Kenya, as you speak to friends and family, does everyone have similar concerns about the schools reopening?
Yes and no. There are parents who are for the reopening of schools, and also there are those who are also not for the reopening of schools. So the reason is why some parents are for the reopening of schools, because the government has guaranteed putting adequate safety measures to avoid cases of transmission and the like. So, but another thing that's putting off parents is that you see, for example, at public schools, public schools accommodate a large number of learners, and sometimes here in our country we do not have enough desks for all pupils. We do not have enough classrooms for all pupils. So what is happening in our country, the Minister of Education has ordered school heads that they do outside learning, whereby you take learners under the trees and make them learn there. So really it's bad. It's bad. I don't know why the government did not take measures maybe to build more classrooms ahead of school opening. The government was not prepared, so parents and learners are now taking the brunt.
Do you think, each of you, that your children will experience a long-term detrimental effect because of this break in their learning? We know that children can be incredibly resilient, but do you fear there could be a long-term consequence of what's happened? What do you think, Hassan?
Yes, 100%. For the elder ones, I mean, those who are on O levels, now my son actually, he is very much concerned because he is saying that he just want to do some start practical life here. You know, the most important thing, first of all, the timing. The time, 1 year. 1 year is a big loss for them.
Makami, what about for your daughter at 4.5? Do you think there will be a long-term impact on her mental health, on her education as a result of the COVID pandemic?
So I cannot compare myself to my parent companion there in Pakistan because, well, he's talking about his older children. Because, you know, for older children, the impact is going to be big and it will last long because they understand the environment, what is happening right now. But for my younger child, I have their age advantage because she might not be able to understand what's happening. Though what might affect her is, you know, the social activities she usually have with her friends because COVID has made us just stay in our homes, not even venture outside and play, you know, and give children the opportunity to play. So yeah, it might affect her, but I feel so much for the older learners.
Well, that was Makami, a mother living in Nairobi in Kenya. And we also heard from Ehsan, who is a father in Islamabad in Pakistan. Now, you may well have heard there that Makami was mentioning rising cases of sexual violence against girls out of school in Kenya. We had a look online and this is what we found. In July last year, Kenya's president ordered an investigation into rising reports of violence against women and girls, including rape, as a result of coronavirus restrictions. Women's rights groups say lockdowns have left women and girls more isolated and vulnerable to abuse. Reuters reports that a national helpline in Kenya, supported by the Department of Gender Affairs, reported over 1,100 calls in June 2020 compared to 86 in February. Now, let's look at the situation in the UK because some schools have opened after the Christmas period, but some have stayed closed. And the conversation continues on whether the children should return to classrooms. It was the subject on the phone-in debate on BBC Radio 5 Live in the UK earlier today, hosted by Nikki Campbell. Let's listen to a part of the conversation.
Confusion reigns on schools. Lisa, tell us more.
At 4:30 yesterday afternoon, we were informed that Doncaster Local Authority had decided to close the schools today in order for them to have a COVID planning day. As you can appreciate, really short notice for working parents. And obviously the main priority is the disruption to the children. It just gives them more uncertainty. They were really looking forward to getting back to a routine of learning, but also to see the friends as well. It's just very disruptive to them.
Ian, as a teacher in Hampshire.
I myself contracted COVID over the Christmas break. Teachers generally feel that we are being neglected by the government. It's all about the children and the children's mental health and well-being, and their learning will have massive gaps. But what the government have failed to acknowledge is that teachers and non-teaching staff in school have their own families.
Well, my situation is that my children should be going back to school on the 6th in 2 days' time. We then found out just as they were breaking up for Christmas that they are not going back until the 18th, but they're going to start online learning on the 11th. I mean, it's just a mess. I just don't understand we're not hearing a lot about teachers in the unions, but what about parents? What are we supposed to do? I have 3 children. One is 16, he's had his exams cancelled twice. One is 12 and has missed the whole, essentially, of his first year of secondary school. And my 8-year-old, who was 7 when all this started, has just become increasingly withdrawn. I mean, I work, my partner works. How are we supposed to pivot as parents and teach 3 children of different ages at home whilst trying to hang on to our jobs?
Well, since then, Scotland has announced a lockdown through the rest of January, meaning that schools will stay closed. And the Prime Minister Boris Johnson is due to address the nation at 8 o'clock UK time. So that's in, 3 hours' time. It's expected he'll tighten restrictions, which could mean more schools stay closed after all. Chloe Tilley with you on OS from the BBC World Service. Let's take a look at some of the stories being worked on by my colleagues. A man has been arrested in the north of Mexico for allegedly beating his 3 sons to death in order to get back at the children's mother. According to a local newspaper, the suspect called his own father to tell him what he'd done, and the grandfather called the police. A court in Algeria has jailed a man who posted satirical cartoons to Facebook mocking the president. Walid Kashida, whose name you may well have seen trending on social media today, has been jailed for 3 years. And the radical Indonesian cleric Abu Bakar Bashir is to be freed from prison on Friday. The 82-year-old will walk free after serving 10 of the 15 years he was given for funding paramilitary training camps. He'd earlier been jailed for masterminding the 2002 Bali bombings, but that conviction was later overturned. Those are the news headlines. Let's get the sport now with Shabnam Yunisjul.
Thank you, Chloe. Well, at the time, England is expecting to hear the Prime Minister reveal tighter COVID restrictions for the country tonight. The Premier League leaders Liverpool will be kicking away at Southampton. Elite sport is expected to continue across the UK. Tonight's match hasn't been completely spared by the virus, though. Southampton goalkeeper Alex McCarthy will be missing after testing positive, while manager Ralph Hasenhüttl will be back in the dugout after a period of self-isolation because he'd been close to someone who tested positive. If Liverpool win this evening, Jurgen Klopp's side will go 3 points clear of second-place Manchester United, but it's pretty competitive at the higher end of the table with just 7 points between the top 10 teams. Here's Klopp.
We wish it would not be that close, but I'm not surprised that it's that close. And our season is so far so good. Not more, not less. If you are neutral, then you will love it. I'm pretty sure, because we'll go to the wire probably.
Southampton, meanwhile, are in 9th place without a win in 4 league games and haven't scored in the last 3.
Thanks, Shabnam. Now let's talk about some business news now. And shareholders in the French car maker PSA Group and the Italian-American manufacturer Fiat Chrysler have approved a merger that will create the world's 4th biggest car company. Let's speak to our international business correspondent, Theo Leggett. So tell us, first of all, who the two companies are, a bit more about them, and they're coming together.
They are indeed, Chloe. So this is PSA Group, which most people will know better, really, as Peugeot Citroën, the French car maker that owns both of those brands, and Fiat Chrysler, which was formed from the merger of the all-Italian car company Fiat and one of the big 3 American car makers, Chrysler. They're going to be merged into a new company, which is going to be called Stellantis. Now, I don't know who thought that one up. The architects of the deal say that the word is derived from the Latin verb stello, meaning to cover with stars. But the rationale for the merger is really very down to earth. It's that the whole car industry is undergoing tremendous change at the moment, with the electrification, the fact that petrol and diesel engines will probably be history within 2 or 3 decades, that cars are becoming more autonomous, self-driving, very connected, so huge amounts of money need to be put into research and development. And if you're doing that, then combining the resources of these two companies makes a lot of sense. It also combines Fiat Chrysler's strength and muscle in North America in those markets with Peugeot and Citroën's strength in the European market. PSA doesn't have that much of a foothold in the United States. So getting these two together, it's about economies of scale and it's about strength and scale in the industry.
Are there concerns about competition when there are fewer companies getting bigger and bigger and bigger?
Well, that question is always raised, but with these companies, you know, the amount of crossover is limited. This was looked at by the European Commission here in Europe, which decided that the deal could go ahead. There is an awareness that with all the pressure on car companies at the moment, the fact that they are having to undergo this tremendous change, that policymakers want them to change because they want to get rid of petrol and diesel engines in order to move with cleaner alternatives. So having that extra scale will help. There is another commercial reason behind this, though, which is also that neither of these companies has that much of a foothold in the Chinese market, and it's seen as a big target for the future, that together perhaps they can crack that market too.
And for consumers, will we see any change? Will there be differences in prices, different models, or is it literally all about trying to go green and bringing out electric cars?
there will be more technology crossover. So beneath the bodywork, cars sold in the United States and cars sold in Europe may well have more common technology. But the brands will remain the same. The parent company will be called Stellantis, but the cars you'll be buying are still going to be Jeeps, they're going to be Chryslers, Fiat, Alfa Romeos. All of those brands will be under the same corporate roof, but they'll still be independent brands with their independent identities as well. One thing that is worth mentioning about this deal, though, is that it represents a further watering down, really, of the old family-dominated European car industry. Remember, Peugeot used to be dominated by the Peugeot family, and Fiat used to be dominated by the Agnelli family. Well, these families do still have stakes in Stellantis, but they're watered down bit by bit, and this merger will water them down further.
Now, before I let you go, Theo, I want to ask you a question about Jack Ma. Lots of people asking, where is he? He's the Chinese billionaire who, well, he hasn't been seen in public since October. What do we know?
Well, I don't know where he is, Chloe. I mean, this is Jack Ma, one of the biggest figures in global e-commerce. He's the Chinese equivalent of Jeff Bezos or Bill Gates. And he hasn't been seen in public, you're right, for a couple of months. And that was shortly after he made a very candid speech, which was widely reported, criticising China's regulators and its state-owned banks, saying that they were an old people's club and that you shouldn't use yesterday's methods to regulate the financial future. Since then, he's not been seen in public, and he withdrew from a panel on a television programme called Africa's Business Heroes. More importantly, though, the initial public offering, the market offering of one of Alibaba Group's leading affiliates, the Ant Group, which was expected to raise billions of dollars, was pulled, with regulators coming in fairly heavy-handed and saying that there were big problems with it. So what it seems to have happened, and we can only speculate here, is he seems to have fallen foul of the Communist Party authorities in China, and for whatever reason, he's being kept on a very tight leash at the moment.
Theo, thank you for that update. That's our international business correspondent, Theo Leggett. Now, we've been hearing conversation from several countries in this edition of the programme about the reopening of schools after coronavirus shutdowns. We were hearing from Makami a little while ago, a mum of a 4.5-year-old in Kenya. She had concerns about sending her daughter back to school, but lots of parents hold a different view. Here's another person who got in touch from Kenya.
BBCOS, this is Aburas Farah from Garissa County. As a parent, I'm one of the parents, and finally we are happy. Schools are open. It is a very hectic time for the teachers. I know it has also been a very hectic time for the children. The only thing that I will only encourage the government to try to encourage the teachers, the school administration to provide psychosocial well-being for the children, because they have been away to provide remedial teaching. Otherwise, we are happy, at least as a parent, our children are going to back still after staying with them for a long time.
Well, if you're in Kenya, do you agree? Do you think it's good that kids are going back to school? If you're in Ghana, in Pakistan, is it good that schools are going to open at the end of the month? If you're here in the UK, is it good that schools are open now? You can get in touch via our WhatsApp number. I'll give it to you on the other side of the news.
This is the BBC World Service, where our new series of presidential profiles starts with Donald Trump.
He had monumental ambition at a very early age.
He's so desperate to be admired, it's quite easy to manipulate him.
Losing is never easy. Not for me, it's not.
They underestimate him over and over and over again.
Presidential profiles of Donald Trump, Tuesday at 9:20 GMT. And in an hour, Outlook with Emily Webb.
When Kirsten Johnson realised her dad had dementia, she decided to make a film about him. One where she staged his death over and over again in a series of fantastical accidents. Her aim was to capture his essence on camera, but it would become a race against time.
Now we return to OS, here on the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
Hello, welcome to OS on the BBC. Chloe Tilley with you. Now, covering the various angles of the COVID-19 pandemic continues to dominate our coverage, and today is no different. As the first people in the world to receive the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine did so today here in the UK, countries around the world are continuing to fight new variants of the virus. The UK has found a new variant, so has South Africa. So with work still continuing to identify whether it will impact the effectiveness of a vaccine. This hour, we're going to speak to a vaccines expert about that, and claims in India that a new vaccine developed there, which hasn't undergone phase 3 clinical trials, has been rushed through. And we'll answer your questions. I'll give you the WhatsApp number after the news. And as schools reopen in Kenya and get the go-ahead in Pakistan and Ghana after being shut for months because of the pandemic, we'll reflect the global conversation being had about whether schools are driving transmissions. And of course, we'll fact-check that with an expert.
Hello, I'm Neil Nunes with the BBC News. The US Justice Department has said it's extremely disappointed and will appeal after a British court refused to extradite the WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange. He faces a range of charges over the publication of thousands of secret military and diplomatic documents. Helena Wilkinson has this report.
As the district judge read out her ruling, Julian Assange closed his eyes. His fiancée, Stella Morris, with whom he has 2 young sons, wept. Mr. Assange's lawyers had argued the case against him was politically motivated and that he wouldn't face a fair trial. But District Judge Vanessa Barreza ruled that US prosecutors had met the tests for him to be extradited. It was because of Mr. Assange's mental health issues that she said he should not be. She said the US was incapable of preventing him from attempting to take his own life.
The top election official in the U.S. state of Georgia has said he did not think it was appropriate for him to take the phone call from Donald Trump in which the president pressed him to find the numbers to overturn Joe Biden's narrow victory there. Brad Raffensperger told U.S. television that the White House pressure had overridden his better judgment. Mr. Raffensperger, a fellow Republican, said he had followed the law and had spent 2 months debunking Mr. Trump's unsubstantiated allegations that the Georgia result was rigged. Mr. Trump tweeted that Republican leaders would go down in history as weak and ineffective. Shareholders in the French carmaker PSA Group and the Italian-American manufacturer Fiat Chrysler have approved a $60 billion merger of the two companies. The new conglomerate, to be called Stellantis, will be the world's 4th largest automotive company. Here's Theo Leggett.
The new car giant will be known as Stellantis, a name which the architects of the deal say is derived from the Latin verb stello, meaning to cover with stars. But the rationale for the merger is rather more down-to-earth. The auto industry is going through a technological revolution. Electric or hydrogen power is set to take over from petrol and diesel within the next 2 decades. Cars themselves are likely to become increasingly connected and autonomous. The merger should allow the 2 companies to pool expertise and resources and save costs.
Britain has become the first country in the world to use the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine to inoculate people against coronavirus. More than 500,000 doses are available to vaccination centres. It's cheaper than the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine and easier to use as it doesn't require ultra-low storage temperatures, but its efficacy rate is not as high. Britain aims to use millions of doses of the vaccines in the weeks ahead, but its health secretary has warned that supply could be a limiting factor. World news from the BBC. France is starting to vaccinate healthcare workers over 50 amid anger at the slow progress of its vaccination campaign. President Macron is reportedly furious, criticizing the pace in one newspaper as like a family stroll. An investigation's been launched in Poland after 18 celebrities and politicians jumped the queue to receive coronavirus vaccinations. Currently, only medical workers and their families are eligible to be vaccinated. Here's Adam Easton.
Announcements on social media by a former Prime Minister, Leszek Miller, and one of Poland's leading actors, Krystyna Janda, that they had already been vaccinated have been widely criticised. A doctor commenting on Miss Janda's post said she was still waiting for her vaccine. Miss Janda's 45-year-old daughter, the actor Maria Severin, said she now regretted her own decision to have the jab. A government spokesman said those that sanctioned the rule-breaking should be fined.
The international nuclear watchdog has confirmed that Iran has resumed 20% uranium enrichment at its underground Fordow nuclear facility in its latest breach of the 2015 nuclear deal. The IAEA said that Iran had begun feeding uranium into 6 centrifuge cascades for further enrichment. The Israeli Prime Minister said the move was aimed at developing nuclear weapons and that Israel would never allow Iran to build them. Workers at Google in the United States have formed a union to support and protect staff. Named after Google's parent company, the Alphabet Workers Union said that as well as focusing on pay and benefits, it would also protect members from what some have seen as arbitrary sackings for staff activism. One recent catalyst was the dismissal of a black artificial intelligence ethics researcher and diversity campaigner. Google said it had always striven to create a supportive workplace. BBC News.
Hello, welcome to OS on the BBC World Service. Chloe Tilley live with you for the next hour. And in around 10 minutes' time, we're going to be speaking to a vaccines expert. He's going to be here to answer your questions. It's Dr. Rick Malley. He's a paediatric infectious disease doctor at Boston Children's Hospital in the US. He specialises in vaccines. So whatever your question, you can get it in now via WhatsApp. I'll put as many of them as I can to him. The WhatsApp number is country code 4477 30 75 19 25. And as I say, he'll be joining us in around 10 minutes to speak vaccines. And one of the things we'll be talking about is obviously these new variants we know. We know there's one in the UK. We also know there's one in South Africa. And one of the questions is, will the current vaccines work against these new variants of the disease? Well, let's bring in the BBC's Nomsa Maseko, who is in Johannesburg, to talk about this. Nomsa, bring us right up to date with the situation regarding this new variant of coronavirus in South Africa right now.
Well, this new variant is wreaking havoc in many places in the country, particularly the number of people who have been admitted in hospitals. There are various hospitals in at least 4 provinces that are at full capacity, some by up to about 150%, which is what which is why the government decided that a ban on the sale of alcohol to ease the traffic at the hospitals would work, because there are many trauma cases that are fueled by alcohol in this country. And as a result of that, that seems to have worked. And also there's a lockdown here with stricter restrictions, a curfew from 9 p.m. until 6 a.m. There is a police visibility all over the place. But the government is saying that it is worried about this new variant, and also the fact that South African scientists are still doing research about it, because they're saying that there's very little that is known at this stage. All they know is that it is highly contagious, but how severe it is compared to the first one when the pandemic was first announced, that is still unclear.
Before we talk about whether it's going to work, the vaccine is going to work, or the vaccines we have is going to work against this new variant, I'm interested to know, if there is a lockdown and there's a curfew and there's all these strict measures in place in South Africa, is that having an effect on the case numbers of this new variant yet?
At this stage, it's very difficult to tell, because I can confirm that in the last 7 days, there has been at least 16,000 new infections every day that have been announced by the health department. And some are saying it was due to the backlog in the test results that were supposed to be confirmed during the Christmas holiday period. They're saying that that's why the number of infections are on the rise at this moment. We don't know yet if the lockdown is working this time around, but I can say that during the first lockdown, everything seemed to be working well until now.
And so what do we know about the effectiveness of the vaccine? Because, of course, there is now a vaccine rollout which is taking place. Where do we stand on knowing whether it will be effective against this new variant?
Well, scientists are hopeful that it will be effective. In fact, they're saying that they have no doubt that it will be effective. Just yesterday afternoon, the country's health minister, Dr. Zweli Mkhize, briefed the press with other scientists, and they were talking about the vaccine rollout, which is expected in the country in the second quarter of the year. And they're saying that they would have to vaccinate at least 67% of the population in order to achieve herd immunity. And they're also saying that the first people that are going to be vaccinated are the country's 1.2 million health workers who have been on the front line, and those will be followed by the elderly and people with comorbidities.
And Nomsa, what about access to these vaccines? We heard so much when there was the announcement that these vaccines had been developed, that wealthy Western nations were effectively hoarding and not giving access to some of the poorer nations. What's the situation in South Africa with access to the vaccines?
Well, South Africa is saying that it has been in contact with the likes of Pfizer, Johnson & Johnson and other companies that are developing vaccines, and that they cannot give a lot of information because of the confidentiality clauses that they have had to sign with these companies. But it seems that the health minister in South Africa was confident when he spoke yesterday, when he said that he is quite confident that the country will receive the vaccinations that are required. But the question here in South Africa, people want to know who is going to be paying for those vaccines, because the poor are saying that they do want the vaccine, but if the government is not paying for it, then they can't afford it.
Thank you, Nomsa. That's the BBC's Nomsa Maseko speaking to us live from Johannesburg. Now, a court in London has ruled that the WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange cannot be extradited to the United States. Assange is wanted over the publication of thousands of classified documents in 2010 and 2011, which the US government claims broke the law and endangered lives. Well, the BBC's Helena Wilkinson has been following the case and told me more about him.
Julian Assange, he's 49 years old. He's an Australian national. He set up in 2006, so a long time ago, he set up a website called WikiLeaks. That website published confidential documents and images, and it was back in April of 2010 when Julian Assange really hit the headlines around the world. And that's because the website WikiLeaks, it released footage which apparently showed US soldiers shooting dead 18 civilians from a helicopter in Iraq. So he has gained a huge amount of support around the world, and we saw that outside the Old Bailey today when we had that hearing handed down by the judge. His supporters would say that he is a campaigner for the truth, that he exposes governments. However, to his critics, and there are many of those too, they would say that he seeks publicity. And also on those charges that you mentioned, the US prosecutors, he is wanted on various charges which the American lawyers during his extradition hearing said that put lives in danger, and he's accused of putting a massive sensitive information into the public domain.
So why did this court in London rule that he can't be extradited to the United States?
So the judge heard both from defence barristers representing Julian Assange and also prosecutors for the Americans. Now, it's important to point out that there was a hearing that took up a lot of last year in London. The first extradition hearing had to be stopped because of the coronavirus pandemic. It then resumed at the Central Criminal Court, also known as the Old Bailey, in London last year, and arguments were heard in court. So it wasn't a trial, but what the district judge had to decide was, based on the evidence she heard, whether Julian Assange should be extradited to America to face trial there on those charges. And today, earlier on, she blocked that extradition request. Now, when she went through why and her decision making, she essentially said that the US prosecutors had met the test for Julian Assange to be extradited. And a reminder of what the US prosecutors were saying, they had said that he was guilty, they say, of releasing the classified documents, and that, they say, put lives in danger. Well, his defence barrister said if he was to be extradited to America, he wouldn't face a fair trial, and the charges that were being brought against Mr. Assange were politically motivated. Well, the judge dismissed most of Julian Assange's defence arguments that were heard in court. However, she went on to touch on his mental health issues, and that was something that was argued in court, that Julian Assange had significant mental health issues. And she said, the district judge said, that he could not be extradited on those grounds. She said that there would be a risk of suicide if he was transferred, extradited to the United States. And it was for that reason that she decided that extradition would be oppressive by reason of mental harm. And that's the reason why she discharged it. And to his supporters outside, they were celebrating when they heard this news, the ruling that he would not be extradited.
So what happens now? I mean, Julian Assange is actually in prison in the UK, isn't he, anyway? So explain a little bit about that, and then obviously what we're expecting from the US.
Yes, so Julian Assange has been at a high security prison called Belmarsh Prison in the UK. He's been held there for over a year now, and there have been various complaints made through his defence lawyers about the conditions that he's been held in there. What will happen next is that on Wednesday, his lawyers will argue at a magistrate's court in London that he should be bailed. Now, what's going to happen is we know US prosecutors are going to appeal against this decision that's been handed down by the district judge. They have 14 days in which they can lodge their grounds for appeal to the High Court in London. But in the meantime, Julian Assange will want to try and apply for bail. Now, that will be heard on Wednesday in front of the same district judge at a magistrate's court. We understand that prosecutors for the United States will try and oppose that bail application. So it's difficult to say at this stage, if he is successful, whether Julian Assange will at that point walk out of the magistrate's court, which will be, of course, a big moment, or whether he will be then taken back to Belmarsh, process, that kind of thing can take a number of hours. So on Wednesday, he will find out if he will be released on bail. But US prosecutors, as we know, are planning to appeal against this decision by the district judge, which was handed down today. So we could see many, many more months of legal proceedings in this case, which has been going on for over a decade.
This is OS on the BBC with me, Chloe Tilley. Let's take a look at some of the latest coronavirus headlines. A hospital in the US state of California is battling a coronavirus outbreak that's believed to stem in part from an inflatable Christmas tree costume. According to local news stations, the costume worn on Christmas Day by a member of staff was powered by a fan that may have spread droplets around the emergency room. More than half the people in France don't want the COVID-19 vaccination, according to a new poll. It comes as the government faces criticism that inoculations there are going far too slowly. Meanwhile, in China, thousands of people have been lining up in the capital Beijing to get vaccinated ahead of next month's Chinese New Year celebrations. Inoculations have been stepped up since Thursday, when the country first gave official approval for a domestically developed drug. Now, let's spend the next few minutes speaking about coronavirus and vaccines. Lots to discuss, so let's bring in another coronavirus expert. We're joined by Dr. Rick Malley, who is a paediatric infectious disease doctor at Boston Children's Hospital, who also specialises in vaccines. Great to have you with us, Dr. Malley, and so much to get through. Let's start by talking about the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, which is being rolled out in the UK today as part of the vaccination programme. In fact, the first patient was an 82-year-old dialysis patient, fittingly in Oxford. How much of a game changer do you think this vaccine can be in light of the fact that it's cheap and it's easy to store?
Yeah, I think it's a fantastic opportunity to try to get a handle on this pandemic, not just in the UK, not just in Europe or the US, but really globally, because as you mentioned, Chloe, this is a vaccine that really has much, much better characteristics for a widespread rollout across the world. It is clearly a very important step in our attempt to control this virus.
So let's talk about variants, because one of the things that come out when we talk about vaccines is these new variants which are being discovered. We were talking about it in the UK, also in South Africa. Are you concerned about whether vaccines will be effective against new variants of COVID-19?
It's a very difficult question. I think the first thing that your listeners should have heard already or know already is that RNA viruses in general are known to mutate very rapidly. So the emergence of variants or mutants should not surprise anybody. And in fact, it was anticipated very early on in the pandemic. What is less certain is how much of a mutation could the virus tolerate to make itself still be able to transmit and still be able to make people sick, while at the same time not be susceptible to the effects, for example, of vaccination. And that is unknown at this time. The studies that have been done since these variants have emerged have relied on using serum or blood from people who were either vaccinated or people who were recovering from the virus, and trying to see if the antibodies that had been produced were still able to neutralize the virus. And to date, the data that we've seen do not suggest that these viruses have in some way managed to escape the ability of antibodies that are generated either by natural infection or by vaccination to grow and survive despite the presence of those antibodies. So that's reassuring news. At the same time, because the virus is raging in so many countries, in the UK, in the US, and many other parts of the world, one can imagine that the more virus is circulating, the greater the opportunity for these viruses to mutate even further and potentially have a variant that emerges, maybe more transmissible, as the variant described in the UK and South Africa seems to be, maybe more able to resist the effect of vaccination. And that, of course, would be a nightmare scenario.
But if that did happen, and obviously we hope that this doesn't happen, but if it did happen that there was a variant where this vaccine didn't work, is it possible just to tweak those vaccines so that they can then be effective against any mutation?
Absolutely. I think it would be incumbent on all of us, vaccine researchers, the companies that are producing the vaccines, to anticipate that possibility. With the RNA vaccines in particular, the ones made by Pfizer and Moderna especially, the ability to modify the spike protein RNA that is being used as the component of the vaccine is something that is relatively simple to do. And while it may be very difficult to come up with a vaccine that covers all the potential COVID-19 variants, you could certainly imagine that over the years, you could tweak, as you say, the mRNA vaccines, even possibly the AstraZeneca vaccine, although that's a little bit more challenging. But you could try to tweak the mRNA vaccines so that they cover the variant or the variants that emerge.
Now, lots of people have been getting in touch with us with questions for you, so I want to play this one to you.
Hello, I'm Balaji from Chennai, India. My question is, what are the stages for approving your vaccines?
And in answering that, I also want to put this to you from Nicole in London, saying, are people testing the vaccine put in direct contact with people bearing the virus, or are they inoculated with the virus to test the reaction? Can you answer both of those?
Absolutely. So in answer to the first question from Chennai, the usual path for vaccine approval is to do initially some small-scale studies in healthy adult volunteers. Then that's generally in the order of perhaps 30 per group, for example. And then you expand it a little bit more in the hundreds to try to see if you have a good immune response and what is the optimal dose that you can glean from the vaccine. And then finally, as has been done with the AstraZeneca vaccine, same for Pfizer and Moderna's and all the other vaccines that are currently being evaluated, you do a very large-scale clinical efficacy trial where you vaccinate a large number of people, 20,000, 30,000 people with either the vaccine or another 20, 30,000 people with a placebo. And unfortunately, you just have to wait till enough cases have occurred so that you can unblind the study and figure out whether the group that got the vaccine was less likely to get sick than the group that did not get the vaccine. That is the traditional way for vaccine development. What we hope will happen over the next several months to years is that we will identify what's called a correlate of protection, which is basically a signature that the patient who receives the vaccine will develop that tells you that that patient is very unlikely to get sick from COVID-19. Once you have that correlative protection, then the development of a new vaccine, the development, for example, as you mentioned, Chloe, of modifications of the vaccine to make sure that the variant is covered, can be greatly accelerated because all you really have to do at that point is vaccinate several hundred people and see if their immune response would predict that they would be protected. Once you get that correlative protection, then I really think you can have a very large number of different vaccines using different technologies, different approaches that will essentially facilitate the development of future vaccines to cover variants or to maintain the control we have over the pandemic.
Let's talk about the India vaccine, because I imagine that question was in part due to this domestic vaccine that's been developed, that has been approved by the authorities before it has gone through the phase 3 trials, which all the other vaccines which are being rolled out have been through. How much does that concern you? Should people be worried about that in India?
Well, I think in general, the process in a pandemic is a little bit different than in a non-pandemic situation. However, having said that, I share the listener's concern, if that's what he was expressing, that a vaccine that gets rolled out without clear evidence of efficacy is a very bad idea. And the reason I say this is twofold. One of them is there's always risks that are associated with any vaccine. We know this. There are small risks. We hope they're minor, but they exist. And so to inject a vaccine into somebody when you don't have any evidence of efficacy is essentially exposing them to risk that they do not need to be exposed to. The second reason that is also very important, and this applies to India as well, is that all the resources that are being used to deploy a vaccine are enormous. And there's logistical, there's cost, there's public confidence in the rollout. And if at the end of the day, all that money, time, effort, and confidence has been wasted on a vaccine that has very marginal or no efficacy, the loss, the opportunity loss, is enormous to the population at large. And so for this reason, I think most vaccinologists, most public health people, most regulators would not be in favor of using the pandemic situation as a justification for bypassing something as important as an efficacy trial.
Now, let me jump in because we've only got a minute or so before the news. I think it's really important to talk about this dosing. Space between the first dose of a vaccine and the second dose, something the UK is going to do. Do you think that's a good idea?
I do think it's a good idea. I think in general, we have found that there's no example that we can think of where delaying a vaccine results in lower immune response. Delaying a second dose results in a lower response globally. The only risk you run in that situation really is that during the time period where the person has not yet received their second dose, their immunity might wane, might drop a little bit, and therefore they might become once again at risk for the infection. However, what the UK is proposing is not an interminable delay in the second dose, but sort of just pushing it back to 12 weeks. And it is very unlikely that the protection that we see after one dose of the vaccine would evaporate in 12 weeks and therefore put all these people at risk.
And it's interesting because actually BioNTech and partner Pfizer have warned today they've got no evidence that their jointly developed vaccine will continue to protect against COVID-19 if the booster shot is given later than tested trials. They're not saying it won't work, they're saying that they don't have evidence.